love seeing faces and feeding off your energy. I recognize that you might be laying down on the couch or doing other things, and we are humans, and that is welcome and accepted. So if you're able to, that would be awesome. Once again, I'm really grateful that you came to join a conversation titled How to Talk to Kids About Race and Racism, because that is the first step to recognizing that, like, this is a conversation we probably should be having if we haven't already. And so just a little bit about me. My name is Jodi Friedman. I am a Jewish woman who grew up in Louisiana. And so definitely had an experience of kind of being othered and knowing what it felt like to have part of my culture not be part of the norm or what was part of my schooling system or the systems around me. And then I became an educator, and I'm an assistant principal. This is my 17th year in education, all at the same school. I started off as a teacher with Teach for America, placed in a school that at the time had all those labels that we think of as a bad school. So, you know, we were rated by the city as failing. We served predominantly Black and Brown children. Most of our families receive public assistance. And it's through my experience there that I really learned a lot about what biases I brought into this profession, even though it was a community I was committed to. And I learned from and with others, and it really impacted who I am now as a school leader. I grew up learning to be colorblind and to just be kind and treat everyone the same. And it was through my experience in education that I realized that that is actually the exact opposite of what we want to do, that we don't want to treat everyone exactly the same because we each have unique identities. And we want to see those unique differences and understand how they impact everyone's experience. And so I also just wanted to provide a context. We are here together in the month of February, which is historically known as Black History Month. For many children in our country, this is the one and only time they learn Black history, if their school even acknowledges this for February. And so we really want to think about not only Black history, but Black past, present, and future month, that it still exists now. And this week is the launching week, actually, of the 5th year of Black Lives Matter at School's Week of Action. And this is a movement to really end zero tolerance discipline, to think about where does ethnic studies live in all of our children's curriculum, this idea of funding counselors and not cops. And so I am very excited to be able to engage with you all today in this conversation during this really powerful month, where we really are meant to honor and understand and push ourselves to revisit and unlearn what we learned in school. And so our goals together for this evening and the next 2 sessions, which we hope you join us for, are that hopefully today we'll share some examples of ways that parents and caregivers can start and continue conversations about race and racism. We'll develop some ideas for next steps on how we can continue our own internal reflection and learning that will inform our parenting and what it means to be actively anti-racist. And we'll have some opportunities today and ongoing to answer some questions. Today, we're not going to have as much discussion with each other, but I hope that the next 2 sessions will. And our goal today is really going to provide some foundational concepts in anti-racism and some shared language, so that then when we are together, we're able to engage. And so if you wouldn't mind taking a brief moment, why don't you just introduce yourself in the chat, like your name and like who's the children in your life that you're here for? Like, what are you hoping to get out of today? And so if you know how to use the chat, you can click on the chat and just type in a brief introduction of who are you, who are the kids you're here for today for, and maybe what are you hoping to get out of our time together over the next 3 sessions. Thank you. Go ahead and feel free to take your time and introduce yourself. Some folks wanting to develop a stronger vocabulary to kind of help them feel more comfortable engaging in the conversation. You have educators and grandparents. What an important role. I don't have my own kids, but I'm a very dedicated aunt. And so I take my anti-racism very seriously in my aunt role as well. Um, so continue introducing yourself in the chat, and just know that I hope that everyone who comes here today gets an opportunity to kind of challenge themselves in their thinking and push their knowledge of what do they need to learn and practice and unlearn. So once again, just thank you for taking that first step in attending today. Because we're here to talk to kids, to talk about why we should talk to kids about race, I thought it was important to ground ourselves by first listening to children. So I'm going to share a video with you. This came out of a series called Being 12. There's lots of different videos, but this is one specifically. So I'm going to play the video for us to kind of ground us in why we need to talk to kids about race and racism.
I'm from Haiti and Nigeria. Like 3 things, like I'm Dominican, Puerto Rican, and Black. I'm biracial. I have an African-American father and an Irish-American mom.
My name's Lamine. I'm Muslim.
I'm Indian, British, Scottish, and American.
My parents are from Venezuela, and I was sharing like one of the foods that we eat, and then I got made fun of. They were like, "What is that? Ew. Oh, ew, what is that?" And like I cried because I felt like, oh, there's something wrong where I'm from. Like maybe like it's bad. Like I'm different.
I am an African-American adopted girl, only child, and I live with my 2 dads. I remember when I was younger, I went with my family to a restaurant, and they made us pay in advance just in case we didn't pay afterwards, and that was kind of upsetting.
You start to notice that people are different, and you have comments, they might be racist or they might not be, but by the time you get older, you know that it is racist and you should stop.
I feel a little scared about if I, just walk down the street, cops might just think I'm doing something bad, and then if I'm trying to explain to them, they won't listen and then just start beating me up and doing terrible things to me.
I think there's this anxiety that kind of comes with being biracial, that kind of eats away at you, almost like you have to prove yourself that you're one or the other. For example, I hear the phrase, "You're not Black," all the time. People sometimes think that I'm supposed to talk ghetto or whatever that is. Oh, she's uneducated because she's African American.
Because I'm Hispanic or Latino, I can't have a lot of money.
Just this weekend, I went with my friend to Urban Outfitters, and we were shopping, and I really wanted to try on this dress, and then this lady that was just there, she was kind of watching me, and I'm just I'm not gonna steal it or anything. I think white privilege is the idea that in your everyday life you're getting treated differently and sometimes with more respect, or people just trust you more, or they have certain expectations of you, you might be smarter or you might be wealthier because you're white. It makes me feel guilty sometimes, even though it's not my fault. I feel guilty for having a privilege that I don't deserve.
If I was ever the mayor or something that controls the policemen, I would want to go out and look in the neighborhoods where there are people that's very friendly, so you can pick them instead of these guys that's just doing all this training. It's better to pick people that's more minded with the community than to just pick some new guy and get on the street. It's just not gonna work out.
We have these kids from, they're Ecuadorian, and they get made fun of because they look Mexican, and they get told on a daily basis, "Oh, you like tacos? Oh, you like churros? How come I saw your mom on the corner selling ices?" It's I feel bad for them personally, because I'm wow, they're not, and even though they tell them I'm not Mexican, I'm Ecuadorian, they still get teased.
I'll share that link to that video later in case anyone wants to revisit it. But I think it's always important to ground ourselves in the words of children. And often as adults, we feel that our kids are too young to talk about topics like race and racism, that, this isn't something we should talk about in school or something that they're not ready for. And I think that these videos are reminders that our kids are receiving messages around race and racism all day long, every day, through what they watch on television, through what they hear, through the words that are used, through what's said, through what's not said. And so our children are receiving these messages daily. And so they are experiencing and internalizing it themselves. And so if they don't have someone in the world to talk with, to engage with, to ask questions about, to be curious about, they're going to just receive the messages that are being sent to them. And so when we think about why we need to talk to kids about race and racism, it's because kids as young as 2 years old start to receive messages around what's good or bad, what's pretty, what's deemed dangerous, or different messages around race. And so when we think about why we're not having this conversation, Glenn Singleton, who is the creator of Courageous Conversations, talks a lot about that normally there's 4 things that keep people from talking about race. One is disbelief. So maybe we're not going to talk about racism here because we don't really believe it is racism. We think it's something else. It's just a different type of interaction, but it's not racism. Possibly ignorance. So you might not talk about it because you feel like you don't know enough to say anything, or you don't know or have the background information. Fear. So you're scared you're going to say the wrong thing, or it's going to be really uncomfortable, so you don't engage. And then for some, fatigue, and this is primarily for people of color, is that they're tired of having the conversation or thinking about the problem. So they keep talking about it, but they don't think it's going to make a difference. And so I'd love you for a quick minute to take a moment to just think about your own challenges engaging in conversations about race and racism, and think about which one of these is really kind of holding you back at times. And feel free just to type it in the chat, just ignorance, fear, disbelief, fatigue. What is that primary 1 or 2 things that are really keeping you from having that conversation with your children or with others? Thank you so much for those that have shared. And so I see a lot of fear. And I will speak for myself as a white person, because I was taught not to talk about race and that talking about race was bad. And I was taught to be colorblind. I have a lot of fear engaging in conversations like this. And when I read the book, White Fragility, and actually I'm still in this book as well, White Supremacy and Me, they talk about this idea of fear, and especially for people who identify or are white passing. And this idea that when we say fear, we're talking about an uncomfortable feeling, so discomfort. We're not actually we don't actually have something we're not fearing safety, right? And so for many people, racism, for Black people, racism is an actual fear of safety in their lives. And for us, when we say fear, we're actually talking about discomfort. And so it's helpful to name it. It's helpful to name that we feel uncomfortable talking about race and it feels scary. And this is a really nice space to push ourselves to say, let's name that. And now say, after seeing that video from the children, that we still have to do it. And it's okay to put ourselves and push ourselves to be uncomfortable, because us not talking about it is leading to situations like police violence and others where people are literally dying and fearing for their lives. And so being uncomfortable isn't fun, but it's a very small ask, right? And so we're going to encourage ourselves today to sit in that feeling of discomfort. So if there's things that I am saying that make you feel like, ooh, that doesn't feel so good to hear, just sit in it, interrogate it, and challenge yourself just to stay with it. Because we'd rather engage and make mistakes in engaging than not engage at all. And so I wanted to root us in a little bit of common language. And so this session, we're going to talk specifically about racism. But the tools and techniques we're talking about really work when we want to engage in conversations around any type of oppression, whether that's sexism or classism or heterosexism or ableism or anti-Semitism. These techniques and what we're talking about here is really naming power and oppression in our country. And so one thing that was really helpful for me was to understand that racism is not just individual acts. It's not just interpersonal relationships. And I think when I first started talking about racism, or people started talking about privilege of whiteness, it felt very personal. And it was helpful for me to really get a broader understanding of oppression in the United States. And so oppression exists in 4 ways. And in our country, it actually started with the foundation of how our country was created and built. And it was built on oppressive ideology. So ideology that some races were smarter or better than others, that some religions were better than others, that some people, white men at the time, could have the right to vote. Actually, white men who owned property had the right to vote. Other people did not. That certain people could go to school and other people couldn't, that certain people could get loans and other people couldn't. And so our country was actually founded on an ideology that gave different people value and power. And so it's important to name that, because when we talk about undoing racism, we're talking about trying to undo 400 years of our country's history. And so it's important to understand that our country was actually founded on that. It was founded on the belief that certain people were okay to enslave, that it was okay to steal people's land and commit genocide against Native Americans or Indigenous people. And so it's an uncomfortable truth of our history, but really important to recognize, because these ideologies were then built into all of the institutions that operate our country. So it was built into the laws of who had voting rights, who had the right to marry, who had the right to a fair trial. It went into the rights of who got to go to school and who didn't, and funding towards schools. And so it became institutionalized. And so these levels of oppression became part of our institutions and part of who got access to different opportunities and who didn't. And these ideologies and these then systems within our institution then impacted how we interact with each other. And this is what most of us tend to think about when we think about racism, is one person behaving one way towards another. And that's interpersonal racism or oppression. And that is very important, but really it's important to zoom out and look at the system. And lastly, what we heard our children talking about was this idea of internalizing oppression. So people who are being oppressed internalize those messages about themselves, that they are not worthy, that they don't have value, that they're not good enough, they're not smart enough, they're not pretty enough, whatever those messages are. And those of us who have power, whether we wanted it or not, whether we consciously held that power over others or not, internalized our superiority and our privilege. And this sometimes plays out in like what we feel that we're entitled to, or what we are deserving of, or what our children are entitled to or deserving of. And so when we talk about any form of oppression, it's important to really address it from all 4 of these categories, because they're all existing at the same time. And so when we talk to kids about racism, it's important to zoom out and not just talk about being kind, but naming the systems and the ideology. And so we'll get into that a little bit further. And so during, it feels important for us to kind of acknowledge some of these foundations of what it means to be anti-racist. So being anti-racist, it takes an understanding that racism is actually embedded into our nation's systems and institutions, and all of us are growing up in a racialized world. We might not have realized as a white person that my world was racialized, but I walked through the world as a white-facing person. And therefore my experiences that I received are based on me being white. And my experiences are different than someone who has a different skin color, or a different gender, or a different sexuality, or a different religion. Being anti-racist is acknowledging that many of us think of ourselves as really good people who are free from bias, but as a result of the privileges that we have and that we are participating in inequitable systems, we are having negative impacts that we often don't see. This work requires us to accept and expect a lack of closure. So whenever I go to a PD or workshop, I'm always like, just tell me what to do and I'll fix it. Like I just want to do it right. And this work, unfortunately, is not about right or wrong or just like a simple fix. No one has all the right answers. This is an ongoing journey of self-exploration and reflection and action. And lastly, the work of being anti-racist is about leaning into discomfort. So acknowledging whatever privileges we have among our different identity markers, and understanding that many of us would rather not talk about race, but we're going to commit that we're going to do that. And we're going to have an open mind and come in with trust and goodwill. And we're not going to debate racism or any aspect of humanity. Our job here is how do we mitigate our negative impact of the words and the actions that we take, or the lack of words that we say or actions that we take. Because both of those behaviors can reinforce racist systems. And so I'd love to share this quote. I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I would love it if anyone would mind unmuting themselves and reading this quote from Dr. Beverly Tatum. Anyone willing just to unmute and read it for us?
I'll go.
Thanks so much.
Because racism is ingrained in the fabric of American institutions, it is easily self-perpetuating. All that is required to maintain it is business as usual. I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. The person engaged in active racist behavior has identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving with it. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racists ahead of them, and choose to turn around, unwilling to go in the same destination as the white supremacists. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I think this quote is beautiful imagery of what anti-racism is. And this really pushed the work of both myself and my school community. Because I spend a lot of time saying, I'm not racist. I'm not racist. Hello, I work in a school community that serves children of color. I'm not racist. And not acknowledging that there's no such thing as not racist. You're either actively anti-racist and interrogating yourself and questioning things and undoing and relearning, or you're moving along that way because the systems themselves inherently create inequitable outcomes. And so it's important to really think about this idea of anti-racism. And so I wanted to share this, and the slides will be available afterwards. So feel free if you want to revisit things. When we think about racism, we often think about overt white supremacy. So lynching, hate crimes, black faces, swastikas, racial slurs, the KKK. Like when we think that word, like that's often the imagery that we have. And that is obviously incredibly terrible and harmful. And so is a lot of the covert white supremacy that is socially acceptable. And so if you take a minute to look at this slide, you will see that white supremacy exists in our culture in so many ways that we didn't realize we were complicit in, that we may have supported, participated in, or even been unaware of. So I'd love you to just take a few seconds and kind of look at what's below that black line and type in the chat, what is one thing that really kind of stood out to you that you had not thought about, that maybe is something that you need to think a little bit more about when it comes to the different ways white supremacy looks like that is socially acceptable? And in our future sessions, we'll have more time to kind of go into this and kind of question what some of these mean. But I think just understanding that white supremacy, if we're just standing still on the moving walkway, all of these things are happening. And it doesn't always look like what we think it looks like. And that some of these we may have participated in, we may still be a part of, these things may be existing in our children's schools. You might even still be doing as a teacher. So for example, up until 3 years ago, our school still had Columbus Day on the calendar. And then through advocacy and projects with our kids, we now call it Indigenous Peoples Day. Or in schools where we talk about Columbus and explorers, and them being explorers and heroes and people exploring the new world, and not as conquerors or colonizers or some of those other stronger terms that reflect what they do. Halloween costumes, the idea of cultural appropriation. So possibly changing our voices or loving the culture of Blackness, and repeating phrases that maybe aren't appropriate for us to say, or dressing in certain ways, telling Black people that they sound eloquent, or that they're such, they sound so educated or great speakers. And a lot of these that some people might call as like microaggressions. And so we'll come back to this slide the next time we're together, but just wanted to kind of name that what we're talking about here is not just the thing at the top of the pyramid that we see, that this white supremacy, which feels like a very loaded word, but really just means that in our culture, whiteness is what is considered supreme or the norm, and that all of these other things are othering the people of color or people who are being oppressed. And so when we think about this idea of privilege, it's important to recognize from the words of Peggy McIntosh that privilege exists when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of the groups they belong to, rather than because of anything they've done or failed to do. Access to privilege doesn't determine one's outcomes, but it is definitely an asset that makes it more likely that whatever talent, ability, and aspirations a person with privilege has will result in something positive for them. And so like the young lady in the video said, sometimes she feels guilty about the privilege she has. And it's okay to feel guilty for a second, but guilty is kind of self-serving. It doesn't get us anywhere. What we need to do is be able to recognize where we hold privilege and where there's systems of inequity, and then work to disrupt those systems. And so lastly, before we kind of get into some conversations of what these conversations can look like, I wanted to share with you a little bit about how kids develop their racial awareness and at what age. So you'll notice that at birth, babies look equally at faces of all races. At 3 months old, babies look more at faces that match the race of their caregivers. Children as young as 2 years old use race to make reasons about people's behaviors. And by 30 months, most children use race to choose playmates. And most often, all children of different races choose white playmates. Expressions of racial prejudice often peak at age 4 and 5. So I want you to just take a moment to sit in that. By age 4 and 5, when probably you have taught your kids, you're watching television, they're learning their ABCs, they're reading beautiful books, they're not watching the news yet, no one's teaching them to hate. They have already developed these ideas around racial lines. And at that age, adults are already viewing Black and brown children different from white. And so there was a very meaningful study done in pre-K classrooms where they followed the eyes of just individuals observing in a pre-K classroom and looking at the behaviors of white children and children of color. And they were able to see the eyes tracking the children of color consistently way more, and noticing behaviors that they found problematic in Black children that were the exact same behaviors that were exhibited by 4 and 5-year-olds white children that were not noticed at all. And so these things are happening through the books that our kids are reading when they only look at books that have white characters, when they watch television and only see whiteness. Students and children develop a sense of what is beautiful or what is good or what is bad. And so white children by 4 and 5 start having preference for whiteness. And by kindergarten, children show many of the same racial attitudes that adults in their culture hold. And even in schools that really value diversity and are doing a lot of anti-racist education, still students pick up messages. And so we've heard stories in our in our pre-K classroom where a child went home who had black skin and kept saying that someone told him his skin was dirty. And mom, like, why is blackness always a bad color? And so this is just another reminder for why we need to talk to kids about race, and how can we come up with ideas for how can we help think of different ways to integrate our children into representation of different races at a young age, so it starts to provide counter narratives to what they're hearing and seeing. And so for the next part of this session, I'm going to unshare my screen, and we're going to just kind of engage in some question and answers. Some people were able to submit questions ahead of time, and those have been integrated into some of the questions that are being asked. Also, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. If we don't get to all of the questions, which we won't, there's never enough time, but we will hold on to those questions and use them to guide the planning for the next 2 sessions.
Thanks, Jodi. This is Nicole Breslow. I thought that was such a powerful slide that you just showed that illustrated how children are developing these concepts at such a young age. And I wanted to start off by asking a question that came up in the registration questions. A bunch of people asked this question. Can you get a little bit more concrete about how you might start a conversation with kids at different age levels? What would a conversation look like at the preschool level, at the elementary school level, middle school, high school? If you can get a little more specific, that would be really helpful.
Sure. And so I think one thing that's helpful to realize is like some of this is like we're talking to kids about race, and some of this is just like how do we engage in all those moments we have with our children all the time, right? So when we're sitting on the subway, when kids notice things, like how do we respond? When we're doing our like bedtime reading, what questions can we ask? And so one thing that's nice is to like take a little bit of the pressure off yourself as the parent or the caregiver of you don't have to have all the answers. You don't necessarily have to go in and say, today I'm going to talk to my kids about race and like think of it as like this really serious thing. Kids are completely open. They question everything around them. I'm sure your kids literally drive you cuckoo with questions all the time. And so it's about sometimes posing questions to our children, helping them notice patterns, or setting up situations where we can ask questions to dig in. And then just also understanding and getting our kids comfortable with like knowing it's okay to talk about differences. And I think that's a huge thing. So when your kids are between birth and age 4, some ways to start developing racial literacy with your children, thinking about what books are you reading with them at home? How many books have white characters only in them? Or, family structures with just a mom and a dad, or, a mom and a dad and not 2 moms. And so just really diversifying your library. I think starting to ask questions or naming, oh, notice like my skin color. What's your skin color? What's their skin color? And knowing that it is okay to name skin color. Black is not a bad word. White is not a bad word. Brown is not a bad word. And it's only taboo because we make it feel taboo. And so one thing we've noticed is that our kids like want to talk about everything. It's the adults who are nervous. And so I think just knowing that like you don't have to have all the answers, but like you can just start thinking like, oh, look at all these dolls. Like, what do we notice about their skin color? Look at all the books we're reading. What do we notice? Look at our characters on the cartoons that we watch. What do we notice? Oh, we notice, and this doesn't have to be just about race. This could be about gender and stereotypes. So looking at images and having them notice, oh, look, all of these images of doctors, what color skin did they have? Oh, does that mean only white people can be doctors? No. Let's look to see if we can find other books that have characters with different skin. And so just really starting to engage in some of that. I think helping kids understand that differences are beautiful. And so it's okay to name how people are different or unique, whether that's religion or You know, sometimes I know when people, kids at school might see someone who has a disability, like we can name those things with children. They are not bad. That is beautiful and that impacts their experience. And so having kids understand that is very helpful. Um, Other conversations that even at a young age, our children have a very clear sense of fairness. Kids know right away, that's fair, that's not fair. And so I think starting to talk with kids about this idea of fairness and that people get treated differently sometimes based off of different reasons. And when have you noticed people getting treated differently? Um, and you can start to introduce the idea that people in our history have been treated differently because of their skin color. And what do you think about that? And our kids don't like that. And our kids will stand up and they will say things often before adults will. So I think ideas of fairness and equity, I think sometimes without realizing it, we reinforce concepts. So we often teach fairness and equality as everyone getting the same thing, right? Everyone got one snack, everyone got one lollipop, that's fair. You and your siblings got the same thing. And so at our school, we've really been thinking about how do we teach kids about equity? How do we make sure we teach kids that everyone needs to get what they need? And that might be different. And so if you have a kid who's super hungry today, they might get 2 snacks while some kid only gets 1. Or some kids might sit in the wobble chair at school while other kids don't need that. Or some kids, one sibling might get an extra book than the other child because that's what they need. And so some of these concepts aren't directly about race, but they're setting our kids up for understanding what equity is and injustice and how do we speak up. I think also conversations on what does it mean to be an ally or an upstander are really important. So how do we speak up when we notice inequity? As kids get older, I mean, as early as 2nd and 3rd grade, even investigating power. I know during the time of the elections, our 2nd graders looked at a visual picture of just the presidents of the United States. And we asked the question, what do you notice? What do you wonder? And those questions can go very far with children when you just present them with information. And just knowing, what do you notice? They're all men. Oh, that's weird. Why do you think that is? We should look into that. Oh, what do you notice? They all have white skin but one. Oh, that's interesting. So in our country, traditionally, the people who hold the power are white men. Let's learn more about that together. And so really just like not feeling like every lesson is like I'm going into with a teaching point and then it has to be tied up in a bow, but really just engaging in those conversations. As kids get older, I think conversations around appropriation, cultural appropriation are really important, and microaggressions. And then especially if your children have friends of color, teaching them like if they were out in public, like what do they need to do as a white person if they were to ever get stopped by the police or in a situation to help protect their friends that are Black and brown. So those are some examples of some of the ways that we could start engaging with our children. Even conversations of when you're grocery shopping and you look at Band-Aids, right? And so anytime we think of the word nude or skin color, it's almost always nude or skin color for people with my skin. And so how could you engage? Be like, oh, that's interesting. That's called skin color. But would that work for your friend or for Juan Treese, your friend, or this person? No. Well, like, why do we think that is? And why are they only this color? And so just asking lots of questions are really beautiful entry points to some of this work.
Great. Thanks, Jodi. So I'm going to, and one follow up to, I think after today's session, we're going to send out a link with some recommended books for our families at all different ages, if you're looking for ideas. So another question we got, which also came in from our list of someone tonight, my child's town or school isn't very diverse. How or where can we find opportunities for them to engage with children from different races and develop real relationships?
That's a really great question. So I think 2 things are important to name. One, that where there's diversity, it doesn't always mean there's not racism, right? And that like having diversity doesn't always mean like the work is still the same. And having a lack of diversity is also still the work needs to be done. And so those 2 things are just important to name because I know lots of people where kids go to very diverse schools and those schools are very segregated. and their kids are gifted and talented and they don't have any Black and brown children in those classes. And so just proximity to Blackness isn't enough. And I think, some things I like to question myself in is like, what are the systems that were created that led for certain communities to be predominantly white and others not? So first, just like going through that process of like, why is that the way it is helpful as the adult and someone who's trying to learn. And then thinking about what other ways are you exposing them to different perspectives, even without actual Black people in their lives, or people of color, or Latino people, or Asian people. So what books are you all reading together? What movies are you watching? And so that's another way to get exposure. And then lastly, and this one is always a tricky one, but one thing that my sister and I talk about often is like, if something is very important to you as a parent, most parents make that happen. So for example, my sister had her kids in like a chess class, and they would commute 50 minutes to go to chess class because that was really important to her. And so if diversity is important to you, I would push us all to think about what do we need to do to then make sure that like what is important to us is what our children are surrounded by, and to push ourselves to find those places and spaces then where our children can encounter more diverse perspectives or family structures or languages or all of those things. And so I know that's not like an easy answer, but I think that that's kind of the work as the caregiver and ourselves, is that there aren't easy answers. We really have to question first, how did this situation become created? And if I really want something, I can figure that out. And so are there different classes I need to get them involved in? Do I need to look into different schools, even if that means I drive 40 minutes to go to a different school? Do I need to figure out different ways or clubs my kids could be a part of? Or are there any social action groups that my kids could be a part of outside of school that would help expose them to different perspectives?
I think you've talked quite a bit about feeling uncomfortable at different times. And another question that came up was parents who have been in a situation where their child has said something, maybe made an observation about race, or said something maybe that could have been taken as a microaggression towards another child in public. And it can make parents feel really uncomfortable, and they're not sure how to address that. So what advice would you have for how parents should handle that situation?
Yeah, so I think going back to that idea that kids, they're just observing, right? And kids have no filter. So like they just name what they see. And in my days as a teacher, like that could be as simple as like, Miss Friedman, what's that red dot on your face? And you're like, oh, that's not nice to say, right? To whatever else that could be. So whether that's like, oh, why is your skin so dark? Or are you dirty? Like your skin is so dark. And so I think knowing that most of the time our kids are coming from a place of true curiosity, we are the ones who are then like putting a judgment on it. And so I think in those moments, naming once again, oh, you notice that person's skin color looks different than yours. Oh, you notice that person's hair looks different than yours. Oh, you noticed that person is on crutches or in a wheelchair or has a different ability than yours. So just like naming what they're noticing, and then also naming that let's learn and explore that more together. And so there's nothing wrong with it. I once had a parent who said to me, I want you to see my child's Blackness. Like Blackness is beautiful, and that is a huge part of who they are. So I don't want you not to see that or not to acknowledge that. It's more that your discomfort around acknowledging it is what makes me uncomfortable. And so I think in those moments, just, yeah, you're right. They do have different hair than we have. And it's beautiful. And then let's talk about that more later, and just leaving it at that, and really making this process a lot of you all learning and exploring together, and just being comfortable. I think as parents, we always think we have to be the expert and know all the answers. And it's totally okay to just be like, oh, that's a good question. I have no idea. Let's learn that together.
Great. So I know another question that comes up is wondering about the role that schools play in incorporating diverse representation into their curricula. And we'd love to hear, just given your experience, what are some of the best practices that you've seen that schools are doing that are doing well with this?
That's a really great question. So a lot of the work that we think about, so there's anti-racism, and then there's also what sometimes you might hear more of, which is like culturally responsive education. And it's this idea that we see individuals and their identities as assets. And often, while we might believe that, in schools, we see those differences as deficits. So when we think about like an achievement gap, right? Oh, these children aren't achieving. Let's fix the children or give them more programs so that then they can achieve. And so this goes back to that idea of the work is about evaluating the system. And so it's not that the children aren't achieving, it's that the system wasn't designed for them to achieve. And so like what systems are barriers for our kids? So I think schools that can really look at not just the content of what they teach, the practice of how they teach, how are kids' voices heard, how are kids being invited to share who they are versus assuming who they are? How do we have high expectations for all children? That is all part of anti-racism in schools, as well as analyzing their practices in the systems in schools. And so this journey is a very long one. And so just to give a few examples of what this could look like in a school. In a school, you could audit your classroom libraries to look at different races and representation. In kindergarten, our kids analyze all of the books for family structures. What family structures are represented and what aren't. And then they write a letter to publishers about like what stories are missing. Like, oh, there's not a lot of stories about two moms. There's not a lot of stories about a titi and a grandma that live in the same house, or someone who's being raised by their abuela. And so like kids at a very young age can notice those things and then advocate for change. And so I think auditing libraries, looking at like in every classroom, what books are you reading aloud? What stories do they tell and what stories do they not tell? And who are the authors of those books? And there's a lot of resources out there for like different questions you can ask as you look at a library. I think questioning standards, which is something I learned to do way too late in my teaching. So for many years, I just taught the 4th grade state standards, which were about westward expansion, explorers, and the foundation of our country. Westward expansion, all about like the gold rush and the opportunities, and not about the trail of tears and the displacement of people, and explorers as heroes, and not the perspective of all the people who were conquered and that land was still someone else's first. And so the standards themselves need to be audited, and we need to decide as schools that we're not going to teach certain things anymore, and to understand what perspectives are missing that we have to teach, right? And so while this is Black History Month, we should not, in white schools or schools children serving children of color, only teach about Black communities when we teach about enslavement and civil rights, which is really the only time I ever heard about Black communities. We should not teach about the achievements of Jewish people only in a unit on the Holocaust, or about religious persecution. We should not teach about LGBTQ only in this one lesson. And so like, how are their stories everyone's stories, right? Everyone's history is American history. So I think really asking your schools, asking your administration and your teachers, like, have you audited your curriculum? Have you audited the books that you're reading? Have you looked at your discipline data? Have you looked at your data of who's in G&T and who's not? As parents, we all can demand a lot from our schools, right? And so when parents really want to demand something, if they want new water fountains, they are going to fundraise and get those water fountains. If they want, to ban uniforms or the certain things, they will unite and demand things. And I think it's time to really question, what are we demanding, both in our schools that only have white children and our more diverse school communities, because all of our children deserve this experience.
That's really helpful. I just wanted to mention that the Westville Public Schools this year went through an audit process of their classroom libraries. We certainly have a long way to go, but that's something that was actually, the parents funded books to fill some gaps in the classroom libraries. So definitely a good step forward there. So those are really helpful ideas for addressing structural racism in schools. I'm wondering if you can share other ways that parents can be proactive in addressing systemic racism in other structures and systems that we might be part of.
Yeah. The PTA is a huge one. So often in schools that have diversity, often the PTA is the people who hold the power are predominantly white families, and they often make decisions for what they think is best for the other communities without actually engaging them. Or sometimes they engage them in a poll, but still think that they, know best. So I think that exists in PTAs often, or different parent groups. I think thinking about extracurriculars that your kids are a part of, and whether it's sports or dance, and just really once again looking at like who's there and who isn't and why, and is if cost is a barrier, often like income or socioeconomic status can be used as a proxy for racism. And so they'll be like, oh, well, they just couldn't afford it. And when we think about historical the historical context of our country, is that has a very close line with race and who could own land and who could get loans and who could get mortgages and all of those things. So access to funds and opportunity and racism go very closely together. And so thinking about how is the school or organization providing funding opportunities for people who might not be able to, or like sliding scales, is another really nice thing to advocate for. So those who can pay more, they do pay more, and those who can't pay what they can. But those kind of systems are really equitable and very helpful.
Great. Another question that came in from on our list is about when you hear something that's either subtle or not so subtle that is racist. Sometimes it might even come from a family member. As parents, what should you do in these situations? Should you correct what you're hearing in front of the person saying it? Should you wait? How do you handle those types of situations?
That's a great question. There's not a perfect answer. I do think it depends on your relationship with the person. And it depends on the relationship with the person, and you should still do something. So I find some phrases that help me are that made me feel a little bit uncomfortable. Or what, sometimes if in that moment I'm not ready to engage, I might come back to it and say something like, I've been thinking a lot about when we last spoke and you said blank, blank, blank. And I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more because there's something that just made me feel uncomfortable about it. And there's other times, like every now and then my dad will just say things and I'll say, that's inappropriate. And we don't talk like that. And like later we can talk more, like if it's in front of my nephews, like we're not going to talk about that. And I'll say to my nephews, that was inappropriate. And I'll clarify why. And then I will follow up with my dad later. And kind of engage him further. Because I think there's one part of like acknowledging the harm and as a white person stepping in. And then there's also that engagement factor of helping someone if they didn't realize why it was harmful. How do we help unpack that and talk about it? Also coming from a place of curiosity. So while intent matters a little bit, impact matters way more. And so whether someone's intentions were to cause harm or not, acknowledging harm is really powerful. In some spaces, we have like in my family and in our school, we use a protocol called ouch, oops. And so if someone says something in that moment, like I might just say ouch. And that's just to like let them know that like something that was said like didn't sit right. And that person in that moment says oops, acknowledging that like they heard that some kind of harm was caused. And we can either engage in that moment or the conversation continues. And that's an opportunity to know that like we're going to follow up later. And so in spaces where you do have relationships with those people ongoing, putting some kind of protocol in place for naming that sometimes helps take the awkwardness out of it. But I think it is always super important to address, especially with our loved ones, because if we can't engage and push them, then who can? And I always often say, like, this is coming from a place of love. And I know what you value. And so I think you'd want to know that like what you just did or said doesn't align with what I think you value. And so like, let's talk about that some more.
How have you seen the conversation about race change over the past year, given the events in the spring, both in school among kids and among families? And I guess what responsibility do parents have to kind of address some of the more extreme things that are happening right now in the news?
Mhm. So that's a really interesting question. I would say that I think I hate using like a silver lining for a terrible crisis because that feels like not an appropriate analogy, but I do think that the conversation around race and racism is way more public now. And I think it always existed. I think people of color have been talking about it for literally centuries and are like, hello, nothing is new here. And so for people of color, this kind of awakening is in some ways very frustrating because they're like, George Floyd was not the first one. Where were you for Tamir Rice? And where were you for, you know, the countless other Black and brown people who were killed at the hands of the police? However, I think it's never too late to start the conversation. And so while it might be frustrating that like it's just starting for some people, it's better now than never. I think there is an awareness and an eye-opening that this was bigger than what people thought. And so in that perspective, I think more people are talking about it and more people are comfortable realizing that we need to talk about it. I also think looking at the shift in like language, right? So there's people who call certain things a protest versus a riot versus an insurrection, and really thinking about what language we're using to describe what happens, right? Or whether we say the incident with George Floyd or like the murder of George Floyd. And so I think as white people really being thoughtful about what language we use, I think I always say I'm not going to get political, but I actually don't believe in that because when I think about politics, to me, it's human rights. And therefore, like I will talk about human rights. But I know for my school, I had always been a school leader who said, like, I believe in social justice. And it wasn't until Trump became president that we started talking about it in our school. And like, what a shame is that? Because Trump didn't bring all of these things existed before. It was louder now, it was on social media and the news more now, but it existed then and it exists now that he is out of office. And so now that it's not in the news, I think there is some fear that the conversation will die down again because we don't have to pay attention to it because it's not everywhere. And so I think the challenge for many of us is to stay engaged, to stay committed, to remember that like anti-racism is like, they said, not only are you walking the opposite way, but you're walking faster than the walkway itself. And if anyone's ever tried to walk the wrong way on a walkway, it is a lot of work to keep up. And so I think remembering that like that is why like the conversations, yes, with our children, yes, with our loved ones, yes, with ourselves, right? And so it's not just the conversation with our children, it's the conversations with ourselves as well. And I think like let's keep up the energy and let's keep our eyes opened and not just kind of get comfortable again. And I think we might have time for like one more question.
Okay, let me take a look. Yeah, so one of the other questions are what are some common examples of unintentional microaggressions that children and parents might be committing, and how can we avoid them? And why are they harmful?
That's a great question. I think depending on like your experiences or your job, different microaggressions could be different. One that I encounter a lot is poverty policing. So how we comment about how different people use their money. Microaggressions equating whenever I say I'm a teacher at a Title I school, the first thing, or that serves Black and brown children, the first thing people say to me is I was like, oh my gosh, that's incredible. You're so amazing. Like, that must be so hard. And so like in that one statement are lots of things that we need to unpack. One, like, why am I amazing? Like I'm a white person going in to like save children. So this idea of like a savior complex is a very big thing that white people need to be careful of. Why would working with Black and brown children, like why is your automatic assumption that like it must be so incredibly hard? And often when we unpack that, it's not because of our country's history and the systems that have push them back, it's because the community is challenging or hard or behavior. So that is one that I see a lot. I see some microaggressions around whenever there is an encounter with a Black person who might be in some form of power or sharing, being like commenting on how eloquent or how smart or how great their English is, depending on if they're an immigrant or not, or those things that are meant to come out as compliments, right, but are not. Commenting on the hair of Black people, of whether it's a cute child and like their hair is, you know, fluffy, of like, oh my gosh, your hair is so cute, can I touch it? Or that type of thing are very common. Some other microaggressions that take some unpacking is this idea around Black neighborhoods. And comments that we might make when we drive through them, when your child has a basketball game in them, when we think about this idea of like, we often equate safety or a lack of safety around Blackness, to be quite honest. And so those are some that definitely stand out to me. Microaggressions of speaking over or for people of color, when you could just ask them how they feel and then give them space to talk. So those are some of the common ones. Constantly, if someone has a hard to pronounce name, not only like telling them that, but then just like not practicing and getting it right. And there's a beautiful TED Talk that talks about that we as white people learn how to say like all these like Russian authors' names and dancers and everyone else, but when we get to the name Juan Trees or, you know, Isabella, we can't say it the way they want us to say it. And so the idea is like, if you really wanted to, you could. And so those are some of the examples that I can think about right now.
Thanks. I think you hit most of the questions. I don't see any new ones in the chat, but we will keep looking at the chat to see if any new ones come in. But I think we can move on to the next section.
Awesome. So please remember, yes, absolutely share in the chat. We will have the next 2 sessions will be designed way more for discussion and participation. I just wanted to make sure we had a little bit of time to kind of sum up what we've spoken about and to share some ideas of what could come next. So just an idea, once again, of what does this work look like? And you're going to get like I called it a 1-pager, but it's really a 2-pager. It's a front and a back with some resources of short videos you can watch and TED Talks and books to read and book lists. But what does anti-racism look like and what could it look like for kids? So talking about and notice skin color, asking questions, and looking at patterns. So, I mean, our 3rd grade, they're in the middle of the fairy tale unit and they literally looked at all the fairy tales we know and said, what do you notice? And they're like, hey, why do girls always have to get saved? Why are the princesses always beautiful? And why are there no Black people in, you know, fairy tales? And so just like giving them information and asking questions and providing books, just lots of beautiful books, and not just books about slavery or not just books about, you know, one child, you know, and her dad, but like a variety of books that just celebrate Black joy or any group's joy. Making space for conversations and just listen. And it sounds so silly, but it's so important for us to model for all of our children changing our mind. Do you know how many adults and how long it took for me to realize it's okay to say out loud that I changed my mind on something, that I used to think this and now I think this. And so I often use prompts with children where I'll say like, oh, I used to think this and now I know this, or I used to think this and now I think this, or I used to think this and now I have no idea this. And like just like naming that together and modeling questioning or learning or changing your mind. Sorry, I clicked my slides. Let me go back. And making mistakes. And this isn't just around racism. Like our kids are terrified to make mistakes or to be wrong. And so it's so important just to model this idea of like malleable intelligence, that we're constantly changing and growing. When we speak with our kids, remember that we're not just speaking about racism as one person to another, but really to talk to kids about systems and power. And that racism is not just discrimination against race, it's discrimination plus power. And so power is what causes oppression, when one person has power over someone else. go beyond teaching about kindness. So not enough to just say, oh, I want my children to be kind growing up. Sometimes interrupting racism isn't kind, and that's okay. We have to do it. And celebrating diversity is not enough. So we can't just say like, oh, we're all beautiful. We need to say we're all beautiful. And unfortunately in our world, this is what's considered beautiful. My nephew's favorite color is brown. And I can't tell you how many times when he would say that, every adult would be like, brown? Your favorite color is brown? I've never met someone whose favorite color is brown. And like, just like, what message does that send? Why can brown not be someone's favorite color? And so just like really naming to him, and we've talked about it, like that is so weird and how unfortunate, because so many people have beautiful brown skin. And so saying those things with children, thinking about how you are using the word fair with your kids, and really start to shift this idea of like giving people what they need. And that is what our goal is, to create a society where everyone has what they need, and that might be different. Talking to our kids about what does it mean to be an ally or an upstander? How can we disrupt inequity or an injustice? Or how can we help someone and shift power? It sounds so simple, but I think about my experience in high school, and like I took up and had a lot of power. I was like beta president and, class president and, the softball team. And I had a lot of power, and I was a white child. And like, where were the places and spaces for me to say like, you know what, this space isn't for me. How can I find someone and help them take up space? Because I have a lot of space right now. And then also just start to question things, and just know that it's okay and it might be uncomfortable. So question your family traditions. My family spent the last year questioning, why do we celebrate Thanksgiving? And realizing that we really loved it and valued it as an opportunity to be together as a family, but that we needed to change some traditions. And so this year we did Thanksgiving, and everyone had to go do some kind of research and do a share. Instead of just what are we grateful for, share something they learned about the Indigenous community and what they're facing right now, and then do some kind of collective action. So what are your family traditions, and how can you question them and create new traditions? And like, what coded language are we using? So when we say good schools, what do we mean by that? When we say good neighborhoods, what do we mean by that? When we say, oh, I was sheltered growing up, what do we mean by that? And just starting to interrogate those things. And so our ways of being: listen a lot, read and research from a wide set of voices. And in the one pager I'm sharing with you, I also shared some like Instagram accounts that are incredible people to follow. So you really diversify the images and voices that you hear from. And some websites like Teaching Tolerance, which just changed its name to Teaching for Justice, and Zen Education, which really has beautiful curriculum things for schools. And so spend time on it. Even though might not be a teacher, go relearn and unlearn history. And so just interrogate those moments when you're feeling uncomfortable. And so lastly, I would love to leave you with this quote. Nicole, since you're unmuted already, would you mind reading it for me?
Sure. Rather than focusing solely on what you say to kids about race, white parents should think more critically and carefully about how what they do on an everyday basis may actually reproduce the very racist ideas and forms of racial inequality that they say they seek to challenge.
And so this came from a Time article. And so talking about racism, super important. And we have to do more than just talk about it. And so how will we disrupt those systems that we are a part of, and our role in this? And so I'd love for us to spend the last few minutes together, just doing a quick moment of reflection. I think it's always important to take that time to model that same process of changing our thinking. And so some questions you might want to ask yourself or journal later. What did you learn or unlearn today? Or what do you need to learn or unlearn? What is one immediate conversation that you could have with your children or your family or your friends tomorrow? How might you interrogate how race shows up in your spheres of influence, whether that's your schools, your job, your social circles, your neighborhoods, your temple, any space that you're a part of? And what can you commit to today? And so I'd love, I think there is a beauty in the power of action and in collectivism. And so what I'd love for us to do is, if you would be willing, I realize it's 8:45 on a Wednesday and you are still here, and I'm so grateful for that. And so if we could end with the energy of a commitment to action and learning and unlearning, I'd love for everyone to take a moment and in the chat, jot down the response to one of these questions, whichever one that you're comfortable sharing with the group right now. We would love to just end with, how did this hour and 10 minutes or 15 minutes impact us, and what collective action, like tomorrow, how are we doing this work? How are we committed to it? So we'll just take a minute or two of silent time while people reflect and type in the chat. And if you want to screenshot this slide for later to come back to these questions, these are great questions to come back to all the time as you commit to anti-racism. We appreciate your vulnerability and you're willing just to kind of take a moment to reflect publicly in the chat. And so we'll give folks another minute. And then whenever you're ready, hit enter, and we'll just kind of like scroll through to get some ideas of what people are thinking about. Thanks, David. Thanks, Kelly and Elizabeth. Super helpful. Give like another 30 seconds for folks to type in the chat. Thanks, Dina. Thanks, Lauren. This is awesome. And so I hope it is really wonderful, just like reading people's reflections and what they're thinking about. It's giving me things to think about. So that idea of looking at what we notice or what we don't notice, to pushing the schools that we're a part of, the people that we love and engage with. So please continue thinking about those questions. And as we wrap up our session today, I just want to thank you so much for being here. Here's my email if you ever wanted to follow up more. I also have my Twitter account, which is NYC Ed for Equity, and my schools, where we really model and share some ways that we as a school are working on anti-racism. If you enjoyed today, we always encourage everyone to support Black organizations and businesses. That's another way to elevate the voices of Black organizations. And so if you wanted to make a donation, 3 that I highly recommend. One is the Alliance for Quality Education. Also check out the work that they're doing around racism and funding for education. The Coalition for Educational Justice is another beautiful one that does a lot of advocacy for schools. And then check out Zen Education. And should you want to make a donation, please, we support that. I do want to acknowledge that I am a white woman doing the work of anti-racism. And so it's important for me to always lift the voices of people of color who are doing that work. And also knowing that I dedicate a lot of time to volunteering to do this work as well, because this work is so important. And so I will have Nicole and Dina wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Jodi. This has been amazing. And just looking at the great comments in the chat, I think it's really clear that you've inspired everyone to have some more courage to have these important conversations. So thank you so much. And I think today really gave everybody sort of a shared foundational knowledge and some shared language that hopefully we can continue to build on. And I hope that everyone here today will want to continue the conversation with us and bring others into the conversation as well. Our next session will be on February 24th and then on March 3rd. And we'll send more information. I think it will be at 7:30 again. I'm going to put a link to a survey, and we would really appreciate if you could fill it out. It asks some questions about how today went for you and also what you'd like to see in our next sessions. And we'll really take your thoughts into account when we're doing our planning. So please let us know what would be most helpful to you and what you'd like to see in these next sessions. Thank you so much for joining us. It was great to have everybody here.
Just thank you, Nicole and Dina, for helping organize this, and Jodi, of course, for giving us so much to think about, so many skills to use with our children, our students as well. I'm looking really, it has empowered me to really think about the curriculum that we use in our preschool at the Temple, as well as our religious school as well, to making sure that we are doing a better job of teaching and educating and opening ourselves up. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening.